Welcome everybody to our May Canada Wildfire webinar. I'm Karen, I'm the research coordinator at Canada Wildfire, and I'm currently in the traditional territories of the Peoples of Treaty 6. This includes the 16 Alberta First Nations and Region 4 of the Métis Nation of Alberta. I'm really happy to welcome Jesse Wallace-Webb back. Jesse joined us in February for our February Flare Up Health Edition webinar series. Today, he's going to be drawing from his master's research to talk to us about the impacts of poor sleep and extended work hours on wildland firefighters. Jesse has worked for the B.C Wildfire Service as a unit crew member and initial attack crew leader over the past 8 years. He recently completed his Master's of Science in Kinesiology at the University of Victoria and now works as a research analyst for the B.C Wildfire Service Research and Innovation Business Area, where he focuses on enhancing firefighter health and well-being through evidence-based approaches. Jesse, I'm really excited to have you back. I know when we had you for kind of your short insight into this in February, people were really excited about it, had a lot of questions. We've already had some crews reaching out, asking us for recordings for this webinar. Very timely that you're here right now with fire season kicking off. So welcome, and I look forward to learning more.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. And hi, everybody. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all today about, a passion of mine, which is the topic of fatigue in firefighting. Before I get into that, I'd like to just acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from Victoria, British Columbia. And so I'd like to acknowledge the Lekwungen and Wasanich speaking peoples whose territories today are represented by the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations, among others. So as I said, and as Karen said, I kind of talked about this a bit at the February Flare Up webinar. And so there's going to be a bit of overlap, but I will be going into more detail into the study findings and ending with some hopefully actionable recommendations and food for thought. So just a bit of background on myself. I started out working for Wildfire in 2016 on unit crew as a crew member out of the Caribou Fire Center, which is where I grew up. I did that during the 2017 and 2018 fire seasons, which are really both really big fire seasons here in BC. Then in 2019, I switched to initial attack and have spent the past 5 summers working as an IA crew leader, both on the coast of British Columbia as well as in the Kootenay area. Through this time, I also went to school each winter studying kinesiology at the University of Victoria. And I think that it was partway through my bachelor's degree, really after the big 2017, 2018 seasons, that I became curious about fatigue, basically starting to wonder how, what are the contributing factors to fatigue and how is it impacting my brain function and ability to make decisions while on the fire line. So this curiosity ended up being the focus of some graduate research. So after completing my bachelor's, I did a master's of science focused in the field of occupational health and safety. And I finished that last fall in 2023. And as Karen said, I'm working now as a research analyst with the Wildfire Service. So feeling kind of lucky to be able to combine both my passions for health research and wildfire. So yeah, that's just a bit of context around where I'm coming to this from, sort of a dual perspective, looking at fatigue, mainly through an academic lens, but also informed by an operational background. So just a quick overview of what I'll be talking about this morning. I'm going to start out with some context, so defining fatigue and talking about its links to health and safety. I'll then go through my master study and all of its main findings, as well as the implications of it. And then finally, I'll take it full circle and end with some recommendations, including discussion of fatigue risk management systems and hopefully some tangible ways that fire agencies can address fatigue management. So to start, defining the term fatigue. What is fatigue and what do we really mean when we're talking about the impacts of fatigue or fatigue risk management systems? Really, fatigue is sort of this vague term that's thrown out in a lot of different conversations, and it is possible that people are referring to different things, whether it be related to burnout, physical recovery, mental health, et cetera, et cetera. So the first thing to recognize about fatigue is that there are different aspects to it, or maybe better said, different ways to view fatigue. So for example, one way we can view fatigue is as a subjective experience. And I'm sure that everybody here is familiar with the experience of feeling fatigued, whether it be caused by work, school, parenting, jet lag, or other reasons. Fatigue as a phenomenon is universal to all humans bound by the laws of physiology. So it comes with related feelings of sleepiness or physical fatigue sometimes, but experientially, everybody confronts the subjective feeling of fatigue at some point. Another way to view fatigue is as an objective state or condition. So here we can talk about the performance impacts that occur as a result of fatigue, which can further be split into physical and mental aspects. You can also talk about short-term or acute fatigue in contrast to long-term or chronic fatigue, sometimes called cumulative fatigue. So this is all to say that fatigue is really an ambiguous term. So to frame this presentation, know that when I'm talking about fatigue today, I'm talking mainly about the short-term mental aspect of fatigue, or more specifically, like the sum of factors contributing to a state of tiredness or reduced brain function. So less so am I talking about the subjective experience of fatigue, and I'm not talking about the physical soreness that you get in your muscles after a hard workout. I'm really talking about the weary, tired, suboptimal state that your mind goes after a long workday, sometimes after not getting enough sleep, that gets in the way of you functioning optimally. So now, yeah, this broad usage of the term fatigue is probably like attributable to its somewhat vague symptomology. It is hard to pinpoint the exact feeling of tiredness, and it's complicated by the fact that this feeling of tiredness is often experienced alongside other related feelings like sleepiness or boredom. Sometimes it's things like stress and anxiety. Because of this, definitions of fatigue are complex and have been wide-ranging in the literature. Like I said, the commonness of fatigue as an everyday term leads it to be used to describe many related yet distinct feelings. So one of these distinctions is between fatigue and sleepiness. That's an especially confusing distinction, as the two do often go hand in hand as a result of sleep loss and are often just grouped together under the lay term of being tired. But really the two are different. So sleepiness is really the propensity to fall asleep. So like when you're struggling to keep your eyes open, whereas fatigue is a more of a brain fog feeling, like when it's difficult to concentrate or difficult to complete mental tasks. Again, they do tend to go hand in hand, but they are distinct, as it's possible to be fatigued but not necessarily sleepy. Now, obviously, depending on what aspect of fatigue we're talking about, the contributing factors are going to be different. So if we're talking about physical fatigue, for example, how hard that you exert yourself during the day physically is probably going to be really important. Whereas if we're talking about mental fatigue, physical exertion might play a role, but it's probably going to be less important. So it gets really difficult when talking about the contributing factors to workplace fatigue, because there are always multiple things having an effect at once. And so individual factors, as well as the relationships between the factors, can't be looked at in isolation because they're always interacting with each other. So we have all these different contributing factors to fatigue, whether they be related to our job demands, our home lives, or just our general health status. And the dangerous thing is that they can feed into each other in a vicious cycle when, maybe it starts with you working a really long day, 14, 16-hour shift that cuts into your time for sleep. Or maybe there are a few things at play. So maybe you had a bit too much caffeine and you're having some conflict with one of your coworkers. And these things lead you to have a really bad night of sleep. Now, because sleep has a reciprocal or two-way relationship with everything else, there's this domino effect wherein first you're sleep deprived, so everything else deteriorates too. Suddenly, you're not eating as well, you don't have enough energy to exercise, you're feeling tired at work, so you don't perform well, and you're less patient with your coworkers. And this also makes your threshold for stress even lower. And what effect does that all that have? It makes you sleep even worse. So you're kept awake at night, ruminating about, conflicts at work, conversations with your spouse, whatever it is. There's good research showing that all these factors affect sleep, and sleep affects all these other factors. So it creates this vicious cycle. You probably experienced it, wherein one thing leads to the next, and now you're fatigued in every sense of the term. So keep in mind that the cycle can also go in reverse. So the less stressed you are, the better you sleep, the better you sleep, the better you eat, the better you eat, the better you feel, and so on. So this entire slide is just to illustrate that one, fatigue is an ambiguous term that's hard to define, and two, it does have a lot of contributing factors, and they're all interconnected. So we can't talk about a single factor in isolation. So this is a theme that I want you to keep in mind. Okay, so moving on to the why fatigue is important and its links to health and safety. And the first thing to understand here is the idea of recognizing fatigue as a workplace hazard, and more specifically, recognizing that the cognitive impairment that results from fatigue is a factor that amplifies existing workplace hazards. This is illustrated by Reason's Swiss cheese model of human error. You may have heard of it. It's basically the idea that workplace accidents often involve a chain of causal factors, also known as hazards. And to mitigate these hazards in the workplace, organizations have controls in place to mitigate risk. So think policies, standard operating procedures, guidelines, etc. But despite these controls, accidents can still occur if multiple underlying failures coincide in space and time. And in occupational settings, fatigue-related cognitive impairment represents one kind of failure. So a prime example of this is lapses in attention. So it's easy to imagine you're driving home after a long day at work. Maybe you only got 6 hours of sleep the night before, and you're feeling fatigued. Now, because you're fatigued, your cognitive ability is likely to be impaired, which includes a slower reaction time. Slower reaction times translate to a slower braking response. So you aren't able to respond as quickly when that deer jumps in front of your truck or whatever the situation is. Maybe you're on the fire line doing a scan for danger trees, but because you're fatigued, your situational awareness is hindered. So you don't notice that one of the trees near the hose lay is burnt out 50 feet up, just hanging on by a thread. So we might have controls in place. So, standard operating procedures for assessing danger trees, but if you don't notice the tree, that could result in an accident if the underlying failures coincide. So fatigue may not even be the hazard itself. The actual hazard is the danger tree, but fatigue comes in as an additional causal factor that makes it more likely for the hazard to pass through the safety controls. And we all know that firefighting is an inherently dangerous job with lots of existing hazards. So the point here is that those existing hazards can be exacerbated by the cognitive impacts of fatigue. Another example of this is fatigue's effect on decision making. So sleep loss, stress, long shifts, they all impair your working memory, which is your ability to keep several things in mind at once and really integrate that information when considering multiple factors in a decision. So what this looks like in the field is an increased tendency to make gut decisions when you're stressed or fatigued, which does have the advantage of being faster, but it's not the best option when there are lots of factors to consider and you need to make a thoughtful, comprehensive plan. So, for example, might lead you to make riskier decisions, pushing for containment on a fire beyond what's actually achievable given the time or resources available, not considering the predicted weather, the time of day, etc. So fatigue and stress hinder our ability to take multiple things into account when making decisions, leading us to forget things and make riskier decisions. So that's more of a theoretical explanation as to how fatigue impacts safety. And I'll just add that it is supported by the research. So sleep loss, long shifts, stress, all these fatigue-related factors have been shown to be associated with an increased risk of workplace injuries. And they're all also associated with impaired brain function too. So it does make sense. So now the link between fatigue and health. Here, it's not necessarily that the short-term state of fatigue is bad for your health, because honestly, I think that the state of tiredness is more so implicated in safety. But this slide is just to show that the associates of fatigue in the long term are implicated in your health as well. So Again, sleep loss, long shifts, stress are all associated with reduced health outcomes, including reduced immune function, mental health, metabolic health, and an increased risk of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, cancer, and all-cause mortality. Remember that all these factors are all interconnected. So if you're stressed and working long shifts, your sleep is likely to get compromised too. And there are probably some shared mechanisms at play here. So really, I don't think that long shifts, for example, have a big effect on health on their own. I think more likely it's that long shifts are influencing health through the mechanisms associated with sleep and stress. So there's really vast literature on both sleep and stress and those effects on health, and it's becoming more understood and how those affect health status. Personally, I think that compromised sleep is the most important fatigue-related health risk factor in the wildfire environment, especially especially it's one that we have a bit of control over. So if you want to dig more into this, Grace Vincent and colleagues out of Australia have a really great view all about sleep in wildland firefighting. And then that they describe some of the challenges to getting a good night of sleep. So take a look at that if you want to dig more into sleep. That's what this graphic on the left is depicting. So there are both operational factors, shift characteristics, as well as environmental factors like noise and temperature that do affect sleep. And then compromised sleep then affects all these other things that we care about, so health, performance, etc. I do think wildland firefighting is somewhat unique in that because of the seasonal nature of wildfires, it means that you typically work really hard during the summer, but then in the winter, you get to take your foot off the gas pedal a bit and recover. So there's this larger scale pattern of work to rest, which is different than other industries. But of course now, fire seasons are getting longer and firefighters are also being pulled in for flood response and other types of all hazard work. So that's pushing into the seasonal period of recovery that people normally get in the winter. So that's all to say that there is a link between fatigue, health, and safety. Further background, I'll just add that this is occurring within the backdrop of a changing climate and longer, more intense fire seasons. We all know this story. Last summer was a prime example in BC with fires all the way from May and June until October. And this season's spring drought conditions indicate that this season is probably not going to be an exception. So just making this link to what we're talking about, what is the effect of this on wildland firefighters? Obviously, longer, more intense seasons translates to increased demands on wildland firefighters. It means more stress, more burnout, less time with loved ones, and more exposure to the health and safety risks inherent to the job. So we all know that firefighting does involve being exposed to some harsh working conditions at time, often including long shifts, suboptimal sleep, and periods of heightened emotional stress. Unfortunately, like I just described, exposure to all of these stressors has been linked to a wide array of negative health and safety related outcomes, but there remains to be a lack of research outside of traditional shift work settings. So there is evidence from other industries. That's where a lot of these references came from, but the demands in wildland firefighting are unique, and there remains to be a gap in understanding. So that's where my study comes in. So how did I address this gap in the research? Well, the objective of my study, my master's study, was to examine the potential cognitive and stress-related impacts of both poor sleep and long shifts in the context of wildland firefighting. So I approached this with two research questions. The first being simply, are measures of stress or brain function associated with sleep or shift characteristics? And then second, do participant factors like age, experience, or biological sex influence any of these relationships? My goal for this project was really to provide insight and recommendation towards improved fatigue management policy within the fire service. So how did I address these questions? We did a completely remote observational within subject study on 25 firefighters from the BC Wildfire Service. So collection ran in 2 phases. First, it was a pilot study in 2021, and then in 2022, we ran a full data collection. Participants were recruited from across the province of BC using both random and convenience-based sampling methods. Again, all data collection was completely remote and self-administered. So this meant that we shipped data collection equipment directly to people's homes and then provided virtual training on the collection procedures. Briefly, this entailed heart rate recording in the morning and evening, as well as some collection at the start and end of their shift. In terms of frequency, participants were asked to collect data once every few days when on fires, as well as on the first day following their subsequent days off. So this went on for 2 to 3 months, starting in July both years, which is really when the core fire season began here in BC. So as I mentioned, a day of data collection began and ended with a 10-minute heart rate recording while participants laid in bed. From this, we measured both heart rate and heart rate variability using the polar chest and wrist monitors. In the results, you'll see R to R interval listed instead of heart rate, but just know that the two are directly inversely related to each other. So I use the two terms somewhat interchangeably. Using the same wristwatch, I was also able to record participants' sleep every night. And using the Polar Flow software, I extracted 12 different sleep metrics, including those related to sleep duration, timing, and quality. Then at the start and end of each shift, participants completed a short survey and cognitive tasks, both of which were done via their smartphone. And daily surveys measured subjective levels of stress, fatigue, and shift information. These were done using the SurveyMonkey app when people were in service and using a physical form when out of service. Brain function was assessed using a 3-minute version of the psychomotor vigilance task, otherwise known as PVT. And the outcome measure I looked at for this task was average response times and lapses in attention, or numbers of lapses in attention, which were defined by response times over 355 milliseconds. So in the results, I'll also use the term fatigue interchangeably with brain function. So if you hear me say fatigue, think reduced brain function. Aside from these daily measures, participants also were administered a baseline questionnaire during enrollment that gathered information on characteristics that were suspected to influence levels of stress and brain function. So these included age, biological sex, years of experience, baseline physical activity. So this was pre-season, number of minutes per week spent doing moderate or vigorous physical activity. And then last, we have trait mindfulness, as well as morning eveningness, which assesses whether one is a morning type person or an evening type person, which is related to chronotype. For my data analysis, I used an all too complicated technique called linear mixed effects modeling. I'll save you the agony of going into too many details here, but essentially I used a reverse elimination process to determine what sleep or what shift characteristics was the most predictive of stress and or fatigue. And then instead of pooling everybody into the same data set, I used separate lines of association to basically control for individual differences between people. That addressed my first question, looking at whether stress or fatigue was associated with sleep and or shift characteristics. And then to address the second question, I added covariates into the model to determine whether or not any of the participant factors like age or experience influence the association found in question 1. So the second part involved assessing whether the slopes of association differed between people. And if they did, I tested for cross-level interactions. So for example, testing whether a factor like age affected the main relationship between, for example, shift duration and heart rate. So on to the results. So what did I find? To start, it was apparent that firefighters were routinely working long shifts and were not receiving adequate sleep on fire suppression days. So average shift durations were nearly 14 hours long, with nearly 90% being recorded as over 12 hours. An average sleep duration on fire suppression days was 6.7 hours. with 70% being less than the recommended 77 hours of sleep. As for the results pertaining to my research questions, I've broken it up into the 4 different relationships that I focused on. So to start, the relationship between sleep and stress. Here, polar sleep score, which is a composite of both quantity and quality metrics, was found to be the best predictor of both subjective stress and morning heart rate, while evening bedtime was the best predictor of heart rate variability. Again, what we're looking at in these figures are separate lines of association that are combined to assess the overall strength of relationship between 2 variables. So as you can see, worse sleep was associated with both higher levels of subjective stress and increased heart rate, while later bedtimes were associated with reduced heart rate variability. As you may know, heart rate and heart rate variability broadly reflect the 2 branches of our autonomic nervous system. So when we get stressed, our sympathetic or fight and flight system is activated, which acts to increase heart rate and reduce heart rate variability. Conversely, when we're in a more relaxed state, our parasympathetic or rest and digest system takes over, and this leads to lower heart rate and increased heart rate variability. So the takeaway here is that insufficient sleep between shifts was directly related to higher levels of stress. Now, random slopes were not indicated for any of the models, so cross-level interactions were not looked at, but several covariates were still found to contribute to model fit, which is shown in this table, which suggests that some of the participant factors may relate to levels of stress. Okay, so now sleep and fatigue, again, fatigue being synonymous with reduced brain function. Here, sleep score was found to be the best predictor of all measures, and as you can see, was negatively associated with increased levels of subjective stress, slower response times, and increased number of attentional lapses. Like with stress, random slopes were not indicated for any of the models, so cross-level interactions were not looked at. But again, several covariates or participant factors were still found to be associated with fatigue outcomes. So again, the takeaway here, simply put, is that poor sleep was directly related to impaired brain function. Also, I'll just add that given sleep score was the best predictor of nearly all measures, it suggests that both sleep quantity and quality are important for recovery. Okay, now the relationship with shift characteristics are a bit more complex. Here, we're looking at the relationship between the shift and stress. So in regard to the first question, shift duration was found to be the best predictor for all measures and was positively related to both increased subjective stress and higher evening heart rate, but there were no shift characteristics that significantly predicted heart rate variability. Significant variation in the slope between people was indicated for heart rate, and looking at the cross-level interactions, both physical activity and meditation experience were found to moderate the relationship. So more specifically, the strength of association between shift duration and heart rate tended to be stronger in individuals who were less physically active during the off-season compared to those who are more physically active. And also, the association was stronger in individuals without meditation experience compared to those with meditation experience. So this suggests that meditation and physical activity may be protective against the negative impacts of long shifts on levels of stress. Now, before I go on, it's also worthwhile pointing out that levels of stress were also found to be higher after shift compared to before shift across every metric, and this pre-post difference increased with longer shift durations. So the takeaway here is that long shifts were related to higher levels of stress, but this effect seemed to be dampened in those that meditated and in those who were more physically active. Now, the relationship between shift and fatigue tells a somewhat similar story. So this time, shift duration was found to be the best predictor and was positively related to all measures, including increased subjective fatigue, slower response times, and increased number of attentional lapses. Random slopes were found for both subjective fatigue and PPT lapses, but cross-level interactions were only indicated for subjective fatigue. As you can see in the figures on the right, trait morning eveningness, physical activity, and meditation all appeared to moderate the relationship between shift duration and subjective fatigue, such that associations were stronger for morning type individuals, individuals with low physical activity, and individuals with meditation experience. So it appears that people who are more physically active tended to feel less tired on following long shifts, whereas morning type people and those who meditated tended to feel more tired. Again, cognitive function was found to be lower after shift compared to before shift across every metric, and this trend increased with longer shifts. So the takeaway here is that long shifts were related to increased levels of fatigue or reduced brain function, but this relationship seemed to differ depending on morning-evening chronotype, physical activity, and meditation experience. So to summarize, pretty much all the findings point in the same direction, being that long shifts and poor sleep were related to both increased levels of stress and reduced brain function. This was true across nearly every measure, the only exception being that heart rate variability was not associated with any shift characteristic and was most associated with evening bedtime rather than overall sleep score. Now, these findings become concerning in light of the fact that poor sleep and long shifts were not the exception on fire suppression days, rather they were the norm. But just because they've become normalized does not subtract from the implications to worker health and safety. So, for example, like I discussed at the start, fatigue-related cognitive impairment does directly increase the risk of workplace accidents and injuries in several ways, including through reduced awareness, more lapses in attention, and poor judgment. Meanwhile, long-term exposure to stress causes excessive wear on bodily systems, which has been linked to a wider range of negative health outcomes, including a higher risk of developing disease. Now, the second question was to see if participant factors influenced any of the relationships from question 1. So this was the case for 2 relationships, both involving shift duration. So the first being that high levels of physical activity and meditation experience appeared to weaken the association between shift duration and heart rate. It also appeared that more physically active people tended to feel less tired following long shifts, whereas morning type people and those who meditated tended to feel more tired. The main implication here is that agencies should recognize that there is a risk to a one-size-fits-all approach to fatigue management, as baseline levels of stress and fatigue vary widely across people, and how one responds to sleep loss and long shifts may depend on both trait-like factors, like whether or not somebody's an evening type person or a morning type person, as well as behavioral factors like physical activity and meditation. So you might be wondering at this point, what can be done by fire agencies to address fatigue management? So the first thing I think to understand about fatigue management is that all fatigue management systems lie along a continuum. So on one end of the spectrum, at the more basic level, we have traditional prescriptive approaches to fatigue management. This is probably the most common approach used right now in wildfire agencies. These approaches are typically simpler and they're compliance-based, so they might just include a basic hours of work policy. The advantage of this is that they're relatively straightforward to implement and maintain, but the disadvantage of these approaches is that they tend to be static and inflexible, so they don't often change much over time, and they're more limited in what they can do, so they provide fewer layers of defense against fatigue-related accidents. On the other end of the spectrum, we have more modern performance-based approaches to fatigue management. These approaches are more complex and they're risk-based. So one advantage of this is that they're more flexible. So what they look like in each context will depend on what the specific workplace hazards of that work environment are. And there are also multiple levels of hazard identification and control, so providing additional layers of defense against fatigue-related accidents. Lastly, these more modern systems are dynamic, so there's ongoing data collection systems and refinement mechanisms built into them. And these are in place to constantly assess their own effectiveness. This makes them iterative in nature, so allowing them to adapt to new information as it comes in, as well as adapt to changing conditions. The disadvantage of this approach is, as you might expect, that there are some barriers to implementation, as well as maintenance. So it sounds good on paper, but how is this kind of system actually accomplished? Obviously, it's going to be associated with a higher cost, both in terms of time and resources. So, more overhead and more oversight. So to succeed with this performance-based approach, organizations need buy-in at all levels, as well as a mature culture around safety that allows them to iterate and change in response to new information. Developing this kind of culture takes time, but it needs to start with leadership and management buy-in. So fatigue risk management systems are widely considered the gold standard of this performance-based approach, and they can be defined as a scientifically based data-driven addition or alternative to prescriptive hours of work limitations that manages fatigue in a flexible manner appropriate to the level of risk and nature of the operation. That may sound a bit all too complicated, but the beauty of these fatigue risk management systems is that organizations can also opt for a hybrid approach. So picking and choosing which components of the fatigue risk management system that they want to implement. And the good news is that this is actually the recommended approach. So in the recent review that assesses effectiveness of these fatigue risk management systems, it says that although there isn't enough evidence to support fatigue risk management systems as a whole, it's just still too early. The components of these systems, so adopting a hybrid approach, has been shown to positively impact fatigue, safety, and performance. Because of this, or with this, performance-based approaches like fatigue risk management systems are gaining popularity worldwide, especially in large, high-risk organizations like those in aviation, healthcare, and transportation. Now, I'll go into some of the components or controls that are in fatigue risk management systems with particular emphasis on those that might be suitable for wildland firefighting. And it might be helpful to link these components or controls, as I'll call them from here on, back to the Swiss cheese model of human error that I talked about at the start. So remember that according to this model, workplace accidents often involve a chain of causal factors or hazards, and accidents occur when multiple underlying failures coincide in space and time. To mitigate these safety hazards, preventing them from turning into accidents, we have controls in place. On the Swiss cheese model of human error, workplace accidents often involve a chain of causal factors, and accidents occur when multiple underlying factors kind of coincide in place and time. So to mitigate these hazards, preventing them from turning into accidents, we have workplace controls in place. So here, think SOGs, SOPs, that kind of stuff. Within the prescriptive approach, hours of work limitations are going to be the main option or control for mitigating these fatigue hazards. So just one layer of defense against fatigue-related accidents. But with the performance-based approach, there are a wider range of control measures available, which means multiple layers of defense against the fatigue-related accidents and injuries. Within a classical fatigue risk management system, these defenses are set up in a tiered or hierarchical way. So Renee, if you don't mind clicking once. So the first level of defense aims to provide employees with an adequate opportunity for rest and recovery. So for example, setting up hours of work policies to allow for 8 hours of sleep, similar to the prescriptive approach. Level 2 controls aim to ensure that the employee actually obtains adequate sleep. So for example, collecting sleep-wake data. And level 3 controls aim to monitor for fatigue-related behaviors. So for example, self-assessment and fatigue detection. Level 4 controls aim to ensure that fatigue-related errors do not lead to fatigue-related accidents. So this could include putting in fatigue-proofing strategies. And then finally, in the event of a fatigue-related accident, level 5 controls aim to identify how and why the other 4 levels of control mechanisms failed. More recently, these layers of defense have been framed more as types of controls as opposed to hierarchical levels. So you can flip to the next slide there. In this review where they looked at the effectiveness of, sorry, one sec. Yeah, in this review where they looked at the effectiveness of various fatigue risk management controls, they categorized the controls into these 3 different types. So they said that controls can either be predictive, proactive, or reactive. Predictive controls, similar to level 1 defenses, include prescriptive hours of work policies, but they also might include other things like screening for sleep disorders and more complex biomathematical models that aim to predict and manage fatigue-related risk. Proactive models are quite wide-ranging, so they could include fatigue education and training. So for example, teaching sleep hygiene principles, as well as stress management techniques. They could also include fatigue monitoring, so collecting sleep-wake data, as well as self-report and performance indicators. And they might also include alertness promoting strategies, such as guidance around caffeine and on-shift napping. And the last type of control are reactive controls. And just like the 5th level of defense, these include fatigue incident reporting and incident investigation. So I think here it's important to just kind of take a step back and consider that actual feasibility of each of these controls may depend on the organization itself. So remembering that all of these require some degree of cost, whether it be financial or time associated with the implementation and maintenance of these new systems. It's also important to recognize that there are a lot of other complexities and trade-offs that need to be confronted when thinking about these sort of systems. So for example, optimizing for manageable workloads and staffing workload balance. There's always going to be some degree of tension between maximizing opportunities for rest on the one hand and maintaining operational capacity on the other hand. Especially when people's finances are tied to hours of work policies, it's not an easy one to navigate. There are also privacy concerns that you need to worry about with these, especially fatigue detection. So when it comes to collecting personal information, sensitive information from people, especially in the public service, there are just red flags that go up when that's being collected by the employer. So these kind of systems can sound great in practice or in theory, but it must be done with proper foresight and planning. And then there's also the idea that some of this is just shifting workloads and fatigue between people. So making things better for some people by introducing this new control, you might be creating additional workload for somebody else who is now responsible for implementing this new system and making sure that it's being followed. So because of these complexities, it's really up to the individual agencies to weigh the advantages and disadvantages of each control, recognizing that some sort of hybrid approach is almost certainly going to be the best way forward. So now, relating this all back to the occupation of wildland firefighting, I've given some thought towards what I think personally could be done by fire agencies to develop their fatigue management systems. So, progressing towards a more performance-based approach. Next slide, please. So in terms of predictive controls, obviously hours of work policies are something that agencies, fire agencies are already doing in some capacity, although the details might differ substantially from one agency to the next. So here talking about maximum shift and deployment lengths, as well as minimum time between shifts and deployments. These policies should specify employees' opportunities for rest and recovery. I think the most important thing here is to ensure that there is a consolidated 8-hour sleep opportunity each night between shifts. Also, roster design and review. I believe that this could be done to take the hours of work policy a step further. Particularly by taking circadian factors into account more by including guidance around night shifts. So recognizing that there is an increased safety hazard when crews are working at night, as our attentional systems are naturally lower. I think there's also opportunity here to place an increased focus on mental health, addressing long-term or chronic burnout, and just better supporting work-life balance. So that's what I think agencies could be doing for predictive controls, proactive controls. I think there's a lot that could be done in this space, a lot of opportunity, and really a good place to start would just be to improve fatigue-related education and training. So I think this is relatively low cost, and I don't think that it should stop with sleep and stress management. I think that there should be more investment in resources available for people to improve more aspects of their overall health and wellness. So this includes sleep. It also includes nutrition, physical activity, mental health. I think mindfulness-based interventions have a role to play here. Really anything that can be given to people that increases their health and resilience, which is going to protect against the health and safety effects of fatigue. So, and that's kind of speaking now in like the broad sense of fatigue. And then finally, reactive controls. I think there's definitely some room for improvement in terms of fatigue incident reporting and investigation. I think this is definitely something that should be incorporated into the existing safety reporting documents. For example, taking hours worked as well as number of consecutive days worked into account when conducting safety incident investigations, and just aiming to better understand what the relationship between fatigue and injury looks like in a wildfire environment. Because I don't think that's very well understood right now. So this would, kind of force agencies to be honest and confront the reality of fatigue in their organization, with honesty and transparency, which would be a step forward in developing the maturity of their broader safety culture and attitude, being adaptable and willing to change in response to new information. Okay, last slide. So this kind of speaks to the final idea, which I want to leave you with today, which is seeing research and exploration of these controls as, stones along the path towards a better understanding of fatigue. So one last click there. And that's really how I think fatigue should inform policy decisions around fatigue management. So no one study or control is going to be the end all be all for fixing fatigue. That's not possible. But each control and in each experiment is just it's more than a drop in the bucket. There are always going to be things that we can better understand about fatigue, and there's always going to be room for improvement when it comes to fatigue management. Because, like I said before, fatigue is really this complex, ambiguous thing that is difficult to define, which also makes it hard to measure and therefore manage. So it really all comes back to this iterative approach that I think should be adopted by fire agencies. So experimenting with new controls with consideration of the current research, evaluating how effective they are, seeing what works, what doesn't, and then repeating this process. And also recognizing that some of these controls might not work out in the end, but even that is valuable information. So not just choosing hours of work policies and sticking to it because, that's what we've always done. It's this iterative approach that's really going to move things forward. Having the mindset of being curious and willing to adapt and innovate, and also learning from other agencies. So doing events like this, seeing what's worked for others and taking a more collaborative approach. And then finally, being humble enough to recognize when accidents do occur and when fatigue did play a role, investigating those accidents to learn and adapt so that we can become better in the future. This signals that organizations are, taking worker health and safety seriously and recognizing that sleep and fatigue related hazards are important and are worth paying attention to. So that's an idea that does get me excited and something that I'm passionate about sharing with wildfire organizations. So I think I'll end it there. We should have some time left for questions, but yeah, thank you for taking the time to tune in today and listen to me drone on about fatigue and fatigue management. Thanks, Karen and Renee and the rest of Canada Wildfire for setting this up. Also, thank you to everybody at UVic and BC Wildfire, including my graduate supervisors and the research team. Yeah, everybody and everything that kind of took me to getting here. Yeah, and all you guys for taking the time.
Awesome. Thanks, Jesse. It's a really interesting topic, and especially when you were showing at the beginning that fatigue cycle and the positive feedback that happens with that, it had me thinking a lot about how we often, well, myself, when I get tired, I almost feel like I pick one of those things on that cycle to just try to keep in line. And it's almost is in some ways like a self-fulfilling prophecy, but then sometimes you like reach that tipping point with that one thing that, like you said, can almost start to reverse it. So
yeah, totally.
Really interesting. I was curious, I know there's been a lot of research done on fatigue and long shifts on, for example, like emergency medicine, structural fire, things like that. And I was curious if you have any insights on like correlation of translation, if like your study could be translated over into that sphere, for example, working like 24 or 48-hour shifts on ambulance or fire truck, but only working 4 days and getting like 8 days off versus 15, 18, or 21 days on a fire.
Yeah.
Is it more like the number of times it's happening, or is it the total duration of one event?
Totally. And yeah, I have to say that I don't know the answer to that. It's definitely an interesting one. I think that there are lessons that can be drawn across, research in different industries, like no matter what, long shifts and sleep are going to play a role. But as to like the specific like rest work requirements, it's going to be dependent on the occupation and like the environmental factors. So even things like in a hospital setting, there's fluorescent lights that are maybe going to keep you more awake at night, whereas in a wildfire environment, you're surrounded by the dark, which is going to make you, naturally more kind of sleepy. So there are other factors to consider. I think that we can take lessons, but at the end of the day, we need to be doing research on wildfire if we want to get recommendations for wildfire.
Well, I agree. So we have a couple questions in the chat. The first is if you could speak to the effect of fatigue on individual differences like sex and work experience, if there are any that you know of.
So yeah, for biological sex and work experience, none of those, neither of those came up in the kind of influenced on relationships that I found in my study. That's not to say that they don't play a role. I know that in other literature they have found to have an effect. But yeah, I can't speak to any of those as it relates to my results. And then I think there was a second part. Are there free resources available for individual fatigue reporting and brain function measurement, survey response time, tests, etc. So as for the first one, I'm not sure. I'm not sure about resources for individual fatigue reporting. Like I said, I think that these could be incorporated into the existing documents. So when you're doing a safety investigation, just including questions like how long did the person work that day before the accident occurred, and how many duty days or like days with overtime were worked leading up to the event. I think that's valuable information. And then in terms of brain function measurement, yes, there are the reaction time tests. So if you look up, psychomotor vigilance test or PVT, there are some free apps that you can get on your phone. And then surveys, yes, there are some surveys too. I think the two that I used in this one were the Sam Pirelli fatigue scale and the Stanford sleepiness scale. So maybe I can gather some resources and send those out. And always happy to answer questions and follow up if people want to get in touch afterwards.
That'd be great if you could share, and then I can distribute out to the group, and we'll also make sure to include them in the link when we post the YouTube video. As you were talking, I was thinking more for like actionable items that maybe agencies could look at. And do you think there could be value in looking into things like more comfortable camping mats, blackout tents, things like that? You talked about being dark, but like I've been on deployment up near the 60th parallel, and it's 3 a.m. and I woke up hearing an aircraft and thought I was late for work, but they were flying infrared, and I got up, got my Nomex on, and then realized it was 3 o'clock in the morning, but it's light out.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah,
Yeah. That's a really great question, and it's kind of funny because this is actually a big focus of what I'm working right now with the BC Wildfire Service in my role as a research analyst. So looking at ways that we can improve sleep and stress for people through what we're giving them. So mainly sleep. So giving sleeping masks and earplugs that work for people. We're looking at also sleeping tents. Broadly looking at health more generally. There's stuff going on. So looking at how can we improve hygiene. At fire camps and on the line, as well as providing clean air for people. So I think there's a lot that could be done in terms of facilities and equipment given to people.
Thanks, Jesse. There is another question posted in the chat. First of all, great study, great presentation. Have you considered merging your work with psychology disciplines? For example, positive and negative stress, overlearned behaviors, culture, etc.
Totally, Al. Thanks for the question. It's a great one. Yeah, a lot of my study, I think, was informed by psychology. I took a lot of psychology in my bachelor's. It was more so focused on cognitive psychology, so more like brain systems and that kind of stuff. So lesser about overlearned behaviors and culture. Although I think that yeah, super interesting topics that I think that future investigations would benefit looking at for sure.
Would you have any kind of quick guidance that you could give? I know BC Wildfire Service is obviously focusing on this with having you in their unit, but for different agencies that maybe haven't gone down this route yet, is there a good starting point for them, or are there opportunities for collaboration with BCWS? Just curious if you have any insights for those from other agencies.
Yeah, a good question. I think a place to start would just be start researching it a little bit. So looking at some of the research that's out there, which I can share in some of the resources, but just becoming more broadly knowledgeable about what fatigue management is and what it's looked like in different agencies, because there are studies that have looked at it. So using those to inform decisions. In terms of collaboration, I think that more should be happening. I think there should be more conversations between organizations. I know that BCWS, we did make some changes to our fatigue management policy guidelines last year, and then solicited some feedback on those changes and have further refined them for this coming year. And I think that there's definitely some step forwards in the current version. Things like recommending 10 hours of sleep between shifts where possible to ensure an 8-hour sleep opportunity. There's updated guidance on consecutive deployments and maximum shift durations and that kind of stuff. So I think that there, would be a lot that could be learned, and maybe that'll have to be the next appearance on Canada Wildfires, talking about BC Wildfire's approach to fatigue management and then how our changes have gone to kind of stimulate some of that.
Yeah, that'd be great. I think it's something that everyone's going to be interested in moving forward. Um, I was also curious, this might be kind of probably outside of the scope of your research, but if you had insights on putting effort into things like off-hour entertainment or de-stress activities. So you talked about, meditation or things like that, but are there things we can do to provide, whether it's like social activities or just things that are fun when our
Yeah,
crews and our staff are on deployment to kind of help with that de-stress cycle after shift? And would that potentially translate into a decrease in stress and a better sleep cycle potentially?
100%, 100%. Yeah, I think, um, yeah, biggest thing in my mind, and it's going to depend on the person, obviously, like what you like to do in your downtime. But I think some things to look to right away are connecting with loved ones, friends, and family. That's going to be a huge part. I think getting outside and being active is going to be really important, and just not putting pressure on yourself. I know personally, I've felt the need to squeeze everything into my 3 or 4 day resets in the summer because they were my only chances of summer. But recognizing that you just did a long deployment and worked a lot of hours, so this is your time to rest and recover. So don't feel bad about just hanging out at home, reading a book, and just kind of taking it easy for the 4 days. But yeah, what it looks like for everybody's going to differ. But I think some pillars: connecting with loved ones, proper nutrition, making sure that you're getting good sleep during those recovery periods are going to be important.
And good cell boosters and Wi-Fi if you can on incident, I guess, to allow that connection to loved ones when you're away, because that can be hard too, right?
Totally.
I'm just looking to see. Okay, so you shared. Thank you for sharing your email. Does anyone have any last questions they'd like to ask before we let Jesse get back to his busy week? I want to thank everyone for hanging in there with us today. I know it's hard this time of year, especially being in operations, to take the time and come, especially with early snowmelt this year. But I'm not seeing any questions, Jesse. Do you have any last words of wisdom you'd like to share with us before we close out?
Not coming to the mind, but yeah, thanks everybody for tuning in today, and yeah, hopefully it's not the last.
Awesome. Yeah, we'd love to hear. We would love to have you back to hear more about what BCWS has tried and what's worked, and maybe what hasn't worked is just as important. So
Mm-hmm.
I look forward to talking more about that. And for everyone here, I will send out a list of resources once Jesse and I have a chance to throw something together. And keep your eyes peeled. We will have this up on YouTube early next week, and we'll be sure to include all of those links to resources in the description there as well. So thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Jesse, for making time for us twice in a couple months to come and talk. I wish you all a safe and restful wildfire season. And I hope that people are keeping first of mind to look out for number one, ensuring that good rest, recovery, and de-stress time. So take care, everyone, and we'll see you again on May 22nd. We're going to have a special webinar on knowledge exchange. And then early June, we'll have one on BC fuel types. So I'll see you all again in a couple weeks. Thanks. Bye, everyone.